Dr. Peter Rosenbaum is past president of the Academy from 1996 to 1998 and its first Canadian president. A longtime member of the Academy, Dr. Rosenbaum has served on numerous committees and is known for his commitment to research and education excellence. In 2007, he received the Academy's Mentorship Award and in 2014, its Lifetime Achievement Award. Dr. Rosenbaum is co-founder of CanChild Center for Childhood Disability Research at McMaster, now recognized worldwide as a leading center of innovative and groundbreaking childhood disability research, including the creation of clinical classifications and measurement tools, and for its award-winning knowledge translation website. Among CanChild's and Rosenbaum's most impactful work has been the co-creation of the F words in childhood disability, a fun way to bring the WHO's ICF framework for health. An avid researcher, lecturer, writer, and teacher, Dr. Rosenbaum has held over 90 peer-reviewed grants, is a contributing author to over 400 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and has co-authored and co-edited several books. He has been a guest lecturer in more than 30 countries and has worked with master's and doctoral level students worldwide. Dr. Rosenbaum's career focus has been on a range of interconnected aspects of childhood disability, issues of the functioning of children and youth, the well-being of families of children with long-term impairments, ways of thinking, talking, and acting to provide services to these kids and families, the language we use to talk about clinical conditions like cerebral palsy and other impairments, and how to communicate these many issues to families, learners, and the general public, including policymakers, in plain and accessible language. Dr. Rosenbaum and his wife, Suzanne, a concert flutist, live in Ontario, Canada. He enjoys music, reading, and writing, and can likely whistle more flute music than the average pediatrician. They have 3 children and 2 grandchildren. Welcome, Dr. Rosenbaum. I'm thrilled to have you here for this past president interview. You're actually the first past president of the series that I've done so far, where I actually know the person in advance, and I'm familiar with your work and think so highly of you. And it is such an honor to have you here.
Thank you kindly.
So grateful. Thank you. Well, why don't we jump right in? And you know, I guess we'd all first like to know, why did you become a developmental pediatrician? And can you tell me a little bit about your journey to get there?
When I started my training in the late 60s, developmental pediatrics didn't exist. I had in effect, a functional approach to what I ended up doing, which was that I knew what I was interested in, and I knew what I was not interested in. I didn't have a particular passion for the biology of the health issues in kids. I did have a particular interest in children and families in long-term illness and in working with children and families in the community. And for social reasons, I knew I was going to go and do some training in London, and spoke to 3 friends at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. I spoke to them independently. They had all spent time in London and described the functional profile of what I was looking for. And they gave me the same answer independently, which was to try to go to the Institute of Child Health and to the Wolfson Center, which was just starting a focus on what we now call developmental pediatrics. And so with the help of the professor of pediatrics at University of Toronto, I was able to get a fellowship, in fact 2, which allowed me to go for a year and stay for 3, and found my métier, my career.
That's wonderful. And we're so fortunate that you found that, and that you found a good fit for yourself.
Yeah.
In more of a social sense than that biological sense. Can you tell me a little bit about your mentors and who helped you along the way?
Well, the professor of pediatrics in Toronto, I owe him a lot, partly because his secretary was my wife's aunt, and that's how I met my wife. But I knew him quite well, and he was very supportive. And I say that because there were others to whom I described my interest who kind of poo-pooed it. And that's a whole other story, but, I really should be doing genetic studies and I should be understanding the biology of disability. And Harry Bain was very supportive and, as I say, wrote letters to support my getting a fellowship. So he was the first one. And then Kenneth Holt, who was the first professor of developmental pediatrics in the UK, had trained with a man named Ronald Illingworth in Sheffield. And Kenneth was appointed to the professorship at the University of London. And he was very instrumental in my thinking, in part because he had assembled a very skilled and well-known group of people, two psychologists, Joan Raynell and Michael Huntley, an excellent physio, an excellent OT, an excellent speech-language therapist, and an excellent social worker. And it was from these people that I really learned the most. I learned a lot from the pediatricians, Kenneth Holt and Joan Raynell, but it was these other people whose professions I knew nothing about. And they were a very effective team. They worked together as a team. I attended team meetings regularly. I presented the cases I was seeing. I sat in with them. And it was this amazing environment that empowered me to make sense of what I was learning. One of the things I learned that was really important was this was largely a so-called assessment center. And there was a concern, I had a concern that we were doing really $1 million, not literally, but very high level assessments, writing long reports, and then putting the letters in the mail and never really understanding or finding out whether the people who got the letters made sense of them, whether the resources we were recommending were available, and so on. And there was less feedback and less follow-up than we should have had and could have had. And I remember thinking that I didn't want to work in a place that just did assessments, because I felt we had both a moral obligation to the families and, quite frankly, a personal obligation to see what was the impact of what we'd said and done, and did it make sense. And seeing the kids and families again allowed us to do that.
Did you talk to them about this? Did you bring up these issues along the way?
I don't think so. I think I was too green, for one thing, and probably wasn't as aware of it as I am sounding like I am now.
Yeah. And when you were working in the assessment clinic and you had this amazing team, what were some of the qualities of the mentors that you learned from, or what were some of the things that struck you?
Patience. CE, willingness to teach, willingness to explain, clarity of language. They didn't try to baffle us with jargon, and were really open to answering questions, discussing things, also listening to them talk with each other. And seek more detailed understanding of what one of them said. Another one might say, well, I don't follow this or whatever. So there was a kind of a climate and an atmosphere where it was, excuse me, it was okay to ask questions. It was okay to not understand. It was okay to have a different point of view.
Right. That seems very important these days. People aren't necessarily accepting of having different point of views. So it's definitely something to learn from your mentors. So moving on to the Academy and why we're here for this interview, who were some of your most cherished friends within the Academy?
Well, when I joined the Academy, I was obviously quite young. I joined in 1974 and attended the first meeting I ever attended was in Denver in 1974. Began and then attended almost every year after that for almost up to the present. Yeah. And I remember one of my young colleagues who was a very bright academic, and he and I did some presentations together, and they used to refer to some of the old guard as the old farts. And then one year he looked at me, he said, "We're becoming the old farts." What was so interesting this is David Cadman, who was a close colleague and friend for many years. What was so apparent is that David had very, very solid academic training in research methodology and research thinking and critical appraisal. And we were becoming aware that much of what we were hearing was, in my opinion, in my experience, I've seen a lot of it, and I don't want to be too rude about that, but I think that that was not academically sound. And so some of us were becoming aware that we were needing to put onto a firmer footing what we were doing, justifying or explaining how we were thinking about things. And that was a very useful experience. That is in no way to put down the old guard, because quite frankly, the old guard were the people who had a passion for childhood disability a long time before most people did, and had the courage to pursue those issues and those interests when other people were rolling their eyes and thinking that we were kind of second-class professionals. So there was and remains a very strong commitment to child well-being, and increasingly to family well-being.
Yeah. Were there any other friends that you had within the academy?
Oh, well, there were many, many, many friends.
Yeah.
Charlene Butler, I have to talk about, because she and I go back to 1982, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff McLaughlin became a very good friend, Rick Stevenson, Jim Blackman. I'm going to leave out people. If I start naming names, I've committed myself already. John Mantovani and Dennis Harper and I we were successive presidents and became very close friends. And we were known around the place as the Three Amigos, because we had a lot of fun together. These are the people who have common purpose, common vision, and they kind of get you, and you get them, and that was enormously reinforcing, and remains so.
What do you think was the most impactful outcome of your presidency?
Ooh, that's a hard question to answer. I'm not sure that anything that happened while I was president was in itself particularly impactful. I do remember, I think I shared with you an anecdote about the fact that the chair of the program committee was my good friend and colleague, Mary Law, who's a social scientist, occupational therapist, and the presidential guest speaker and other leading public events were presented by women who were quite outspoken feminists. Now, they weren't bra-burning feminists in that sense, but I can remember overhearing people being very frustrated that we were trying to make the whole academy into a feminist organization. What we were in fact trying to do was bring complementary perspectives complementary to the biomedical. So one of the presidential guest speaker was Emmy Werner, and Emmy Werner is, I think, possibly a psychologist, possibly a social worker, but certainly a social scientist who had done some absolutely stunning work in Hawaii, following a large cohort of children, a birth cohort, over decades, and showing the role of the social determinants of health. And in the 1990s, that was not particularly popular, or at least there wasn't a popular notion that was being talked about. So in that sense, I think, I hope we were at least provoking people to think about these things, even if they felt we were being too far to the left.
A little too feminist.
In the time I was particularly active in the administration, and this was through the second half of the 90s, Jim Blackman, Bob Armstrong, and myself, and probably many others, just the names that jumped to the front of my mind, were talking about an international organization. At that time, talking about changing the name of the American Academy, which nearly got me into very big anatomical trouble. But there were serious discussions about trying to make something happen across at that point, the American Academy and the European Academy, and then the Australasian Academy developed relatively soon after that. And so the International Alliance of academies of childhood disability, which is now thriving, really came out of some of those discussions. And I'm not in any way claiming that I'm responsible for that, but I was certainly part of those discussions. And I think it was a very exciting development, because we have a hell of a lot to learn from people dealing with the same issues, experiencing the same issues in other parts of the world where the resources are different, the culture is different, the thinking is different, the opportunities are different. And we can't simply be cultural imperialists and assume that the way we do things is the only way. And so we have been learning a huge amount, and the Academy has become, even the American Academy before the IAACD, has become increasingly international. With 40, 50, 60 countries represented and presenting at the American Academy. So that part of our activity, I think, has been very, very important.
Yeah, and I think it sort of flows into my next question. And how does that, I guess, formulate your vision for the Academy?
I think the Academy, as the oldest of these kinds of organizations, has an opportunity, a responsibility to be formulating ideas, translating new thinking, accommodating, adapting, growing, developing. And that, to me, is a good chunk of what we do. So we're not just talking about the important developments in orthopedic management of the hip, which is still as important as ever, but we're thinking about other things that didn't used to be thought about and talked about. So we're thinking much more about for example, life course. And I remember being at the American Academy meeting in Boston in 1980, and Martin Bax, the longtime editor of Developmental Medicine, organized a symposium on adults with child onset conditions. And many of us said, oh my God, yeah, they grow up, they become adults. And there was almost nothing systematic to be talked about. There were a lot of issues identified. It was a very good session, but it was that kind of leadership in recognizing that there was more to the story than what we had focused on with children. And that represented, and I used the word development before, it's one of my favorite words, it represented a development of the Academy and of our awareness of where things needed to go and where we as an Academy could contribute.
It sounds a little similar to where you started out, and you're from a biomedical to a social, and that the Academy has the opportunity to look at that life course in that way.
Can I just add that this, in no way do I want any of my comments to be construed or misconstrued, or as one of my friends used to say, misconstrued, as denigrating the biomedical. Not at all. No. I think what we have been interested in, and certainly with the World Health Organization's ideas over the last 20 years, we've been interested in expanding the scope, widening the scope to include, but not focus exclusively on the biomedical. So I'm not unhappy with people who want to understand the biomedical. It's just not what I want to do. Right. And
it seems like they're symbiotic.
Yes, absolutely.
It has to be.
Absolutely. The hip bone is connected to the thigh.
Exactly. So tell me what you're most proud of so far in your career.
Most proud of, I think, it would have to be CanChild.
Yeah.
CanChild Center for Childhood Disability Research, which Mary Law and I put together. We saw an opportunity. We had been doing pieces of work, a discrete study here, a discrete study there. She'd been doing her work, I'd been doing my work. We had some colleagues in common, and we tried to find what I like to refer to as free money. We were looking for money that would allow us to create a research group and have the free money would be infrastructure money to pay a couple of our really very talented research staff, both of whom went on to acquire master's degrees, and one ended up doing a PhD while working with us. And we wanted to be able to create a research program that didn't depend on what money we could get for the grants, because we had recognized, and this is in the mid 80s, that the research funding tail was wagging the research dog. What could we get money for? And if we could get money for it, we'd go for the money and then do the study that the agency that funded us wanted us to do, but it wasn't necessarily what we wanted to do. So the opportunity arose, and it's a long story and the details don't matter, but the opportunity arose to get money from our provincial health ministry and for a 5-year program. And we developed that program, and in the 4th year, we had the opportunity to apply for a second 5 years. We're refunded. So we now had a solid infrastructure, which allowed us then to not only to do the studies we were interested in, but to start to build programs. And that meant that one could take a bite-sized piece out of an issue and recognize that when we'd done that, we could do the next piece and the next piece and the next piece. And here we are. This is from July 1st, 1989. We're in our 32nd or 33rd year. Yeah. Never would have imagined that to be the case. And that has allowed us then to pursue programs of research, a whole variety of things in family-centered service, in motor development in children with cerebral palsy, latterly in our work with the F words for childhood disability, and now F words for child development. And this has been just an amazing and continuing learning experience. An additional element of this is, of course, I shouldn't say of course, working with young people who come along as graduate students and who become our teachers, yeah. Who bring new ideas, new understanding of research methodology. We have a huge activity in knowledge translation and in studying using knowledge, information science to both inform how we do things, and I think we do things better than we used to, and also study it. So there was an Ogden Nash poem that said, "Little fleas have smaller fleas upon their backs to bite them, and these in turn have smaller fleas, and so ad infinitum." And that's how I think about what we do, because we're doing the research, we're studying what we're doing, and we're reporting what we're learning about the substance of the research, but at the same time learning about what we're learning about.
And that's the key, though, to make to have that impact, and ultimately, why are you doing this? And you're doing it to impact the individuals with disabilities and their families, and that's what you've been able to do. That's amazing. How do you think the field has changed?
Unrecognizable. I often, when people ask that kind of a question, I say I'd love to go back to just reflect on what I was being taught and what I was learning in 1970. Mm-hmm. And the field is unrecognizably different, mostly because I think, as I said earlier, I think the spotlight has become much bigger. The spotlight used to be on the diagnosis and on the odyssey to make the right diagnosis, and then the interventions, which were almost entirely biomedical,
right?
At least in the mainstream. And then, particularly in the last 20 years, with the World Health Organization's thinking about health more broadly, the spotlight's got a lot bigger. And in addition to the focus on the biomedical, there's a focus on, well, how does the biomedical affect you in day-to-day functioning? Yeah. And how does it affect whether and how you can do what you want to do, which they call participation, and which I think is fundamentally important, because it's been brought right onto front of the stage. And then an expectation that not only do we think about personal factors, which everybody knows are important, and environmental factors, which everybody knows are important, now these are formally part of the framework of health. And so we now have a biomedical, psychosocial framework of biopsychosocial, biological, the psychological, and the social integrated into one component. And now we can ask questions about why are we doing this and what do we hope to achieve with this? And is this the best way to achieve it? Is this a relevant thing to achieve? And so on. And that is fundamentally more exciting than it used to be.
Absolutely. And I think I think so much of this goes back to what we just discussed, your contribution to this and being able to translate it to the families ultimately being able to understand it. And
well, I think I will accept that we've, we've tried to be cute about it with the F words.
Yeah.
And that was really a tongue-in-cheek kind of throwaway idea. We wrote a paper and it got published. And, 10 years on, the paper's been downloaded almost 50,000 times.
Yeah, it's got some legs.
Translated. The ideas have been translated into 35 languages. We've been able to bring some plain language thinking to this, but the World Health Organization really started it all.
Yeah, well, it's to me, it was able to simplify it in a way that families can understand it, that educators and people that aren't necessarily in the medical field can take it and run with it, and that has been.
I think I told you that one of the most profound 7-word sentences in my whole career was said to me by a parent who's been part of a research study we've completed and now is a co-investigator with us on other projects. She said, "You have textbooks, we have storybooks." And that is just such a beautiful encapsulation of the complementary perspectives of medically trained health professionals who think about primarily what is it, what's going on, what are the underlying causes and so on, and the individual realities, the individual predicaments of the people whose kids have it.
Right. So throughout this conversation, you've had a lot of advice. I mean, you have a lot of advice for professionals and for parents, I feel like, but is there advice for current Academy members that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, ask, don't ever say we can't do that. Ask, why can't we do that? Yeah. Be curious, ask questions, be comfortable to think outside the box, get rid of the box. Actually, I think that we should stop thinking outside the box and just get rid of the box altogether. I think it's always okay to ask questions. It's not okay to be cynical. It's not okay to just ignore things. But I think we should be prepared to recognize how much has changed, how much is changing in our field. Sometimes because of people in our field, and lots of times because of things going on around us. Mm-hmm. One of the most dramatic examples, I suppose, is that the current political climate in 2022 involves people having much less respect for expertise than they used to. Yeah. And Dr. Google is in her office 24 hours a day. So we now have to be more modest in our expectations of ourselves because there's a lot of other information out there. I think we need to be prepared to listen always to parents' dilemmas and to try to understand what's underneath the question that they're asking, to be supportive, and most particularly, I suppose, to take a positive view of things, to take a strengths-based view of things. I sometimes introduce myself when I lecture as a non-Asian, non-woman, which is, I think, visibly true and tells you absolutely nothing about me. And I use that to caricature our classical approach to the catalog of doom of things that kids won't be able to do. And I don't think that's helpful to anybody. What I think is helpful is to talk about what, first of all, to find out from parents, what can their kids do? What do they like about their kids? And what are their aspirations for their kids? And what are their kids' interests and aspirations? And how can we facilitate that even if they end up doing things differently? Most of us are not world-class at anything, but we have traditionally expected kids to learn to do things and do them nicely and do them normally and kind of, get after them if they're not walking nicely or if they're not talking nicely. I want to know what they're going to do with their walking. I want to know what they're going to do with their talking. And can we engage kids and families in ways that are about child and family development and being and becoming and belonging?
That's beautiful advice. Thank you. What gives you hope?
Oh, looking back. If you were to interview me the first day I went to my training in London and said, what do you think the field's going to look like? I probably wouldn't have had a lot of imagination, but I sure as hell would not have imagined that we'd be where we are now. And that gives me enormous hope.
And how do you want to be remembered?
Somebody who had fun, who asked questions, who had the courage of his convictions, who wasn't put off by being told that what I did was, it must be, many of us actually have been told, you must be very dedicated, which is a snide way of saying, why the hell couldn't you get a proper job and be a regular doctor or a regular health professional? And that's never bothered me. And, I've had the courage of my convictions. And I hope that people will, be comfortable to try to take that approach to things and not be put off because you can't do it. I will add something that you just made me think about, and that is, in looking back at some of the received wisdom and some of the classical studies, sometimes refracting those ideas through a modern lens allows us to see things we didn't see before. And one example is a very good randomized clinical trial that was done by Fred Palmer and his colleagues at Johns Hopkins and published in 1988, and was a study of a therapy approach compared to an early intervention approach, with, I think, the expectation that the therapy approach would produce better outcomes for kids aged 12 to 19 months who had diplegic cerebral palsy. And at 6 months, when the groups were compared, the early intervention group was doing better. And at 12 months, after both groups had had 6 months of physical therapy, the early intervention group was doing better. And the interpretation at the time was somewhat surprise and disappointment that the physical therapy approach hadn't had a better outcome, because that reflected the way we were thinking. And that is an analytically but not socially critical comment. And when we look back, we recognize, and I wrote an editorial about this a few years ago, that almost certainly what we should have said, what the hell's going on here? Why are these kids doing as well as they're doing? And it was probably because they were being empowered to pursue child development, activity, mobility, and so on, even though they didn't do it nicely, the way the therapies at the time were expecting. And we really should have paid attention. But as I say, in looking back, we can now see, maybe that's what was going on. So, we can look at the world through new lenses and see things that might have been there before, but we didn't see them because we had a particular perspective. If I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it.